All right, hello everybody. This is Antonio Wolf here doing another reading with a slightly larger group than usual. Today we are reading Hegel's Lectures on the Proofs of the Existence of God from 1829. These are not usually lectures that you hear people suggest as reading material. The usual suggestions are phenomenology of spirit, science of logic, philosophy of history, certainly the next big one. Sometimes people mention philosophy of right. Very rarely do you hear the aesthetics. Sometimes some people suggest the encyclopedia. But I've only once encountered somebody mention the lectures on the proofs of the existence of God. I saw a good comment by somebody whose intelligence I recognize and respect, and they said something very interesting about these lectures. They consider these to be the third introduction to the system, properly speaking. The first being the phenomenology of spirit, next one being the science of logic, and the third attempt being the lectures on the proofs for the existence of God. And the way they described it, as I remember, is that whereas the phenomenology, of course, begins, and it tells you, it begins with the opposition of consciousness, that assumption. And the science of logic begins with presuppositionless cognition, which ends up being, at least the very immediacy, concept of being. These are related to the science of logic, and were given as a set of lectures that were concurrent with his lectures on the science of logic. So they were meant to be as a supplement to his students who were taking those classes at the time with him. So there's a heavy correlation between what goes on in these lectures and what goes on in the science of logic, particularly the middle section of the science of logic and the second section, which is logic of essence and the logic of the concept. And why is that? Well, and it begins at the late stage of the logic of essence, because the cosmological proofs have to do with the very concept of causality, and therefore you enter into the system at that starting point of causality. The teleological proof, obviously, has to do with then the logic of objectivity in the concept. And finally, the ontological proof has to do with the nature of the idea itself. So we have that traversal into the domains of pure logic, metaphysics, and whatnot. So we're not getting straight onto the lectures. These are the introductory lectures, where Hegel's going to lay out to us what he takes his project in these lectures to be. And they're a bit lengthy, so we probably won't get through it today. Hopefully we find it time to get through them another time as well, probably tomorrow. But yes, with that being said, let's get going. The occasion for these lectures. These lectures are devoted to a consideration of the proofs of the existence of God. The external occasion for them is this. I had to decide to give only one set of lectures in this summer semester on a whole topic of philosophical science, and then I wanted to add a second set on at least one individual topic. I have therefore chosen a topic that is connected with the other lectures that I am giving on logic, a topic that constitutes not in content, but in form, a kind of supplement to those lectures, since it is concerned with only a specific aspect of the basic conceptions of logic. These lectures are therefore principally intended for those of my auditors who are attending the other lectures, and to them they will be the most readily intelligible. And if you hear music in the background, I apologize. There's nothing I can do, and I hope the YouTube algorithm does not detect it as intelligible music, so it won't ban me.
No, it's not going to happen. It's very faint.
Only the music of your voice, Antonio.
Since our task, however, is to consider the proofs of the existence of God, it appears that only one aspect of this topic belongs to logic, namely the nature of proof, while the other aspect, the content, that is God, belongs to another sphere, that of religion and its rational consideration, philosophy of religion. In fact, it is a component of the latter that is to be set apart and treated by itself in these lectures, In what follows, it shall be shown more clearly how this component relates to the whole of the doctrine of religion, and further that this doctrine, insofar as it is scientific, and the sphere of logic do not fall outside each other, to the extent... wait, did I say something? Okay, that was just a weird sentence. And further that this doctrine, insofar as it is scientific, and the sphere of logic do not fall outside each other, to the extent that would appear from the first statement of our aim. The logical does not merely constitute the formal aspect, but rather stands precisely at the middle of the content. That's something somewhat important. If you've heard the logic, nature, spirit triad, logic stands as the middle ground, or the middle term, as one would say, between nature and spirit, which puts logic in a position that people generally do not understand to be the case. People think that spirit sublates logic and nature and is their truth. Hegel has some things in certain places that very strongly hint that it is otherwise, that it is actually logic that finally sublates both nature and spirit and reveals the truth as such. Excuse me, sorry. Just another aside. If you have listened to the last reading groups that we did on the science of logic, we made it all the way to the end of chapter 2, which, by the way, I accidentally deleted the final lecture or reading group we did on that, which was on the final comments Hegel makes on that chapter. And I said a lot of good things, and I don't know why it is that I made the mistake of deleting it, but for some reason I had a couple lectures that I hadn't deleted yet, and I suppose I was going through and cleaning it out, and I accidentally deleted the wrong one. But anyways, the reason I bring that up is because this middle ground, this middle term that connects things as logic has a lot to do with what the nature of infinity and finitude in that chapter have to do with. So if you're familiar with that movement, you have a pretty good intuition and some level of concrete knowledge as to what that specifically entails. Continuing, discrediting of the proofs in modern culture. The first thing we encounter when we seek to make a beginning with the execution of our designs is the general, and as far as this design is concerned, repugnant view of the cultural presuppositions of our time. If the object, God, is capable in itself of elevating our spirit by its very name, of stirring our soul to its innermost depths, then this lofty expectation may just as quickly die away when we consider that it is the proofs of the existence of God with which we are about to occupy ourselves. For the proofs of the existence of God are discredited to such an extent that they pass for something antiquated, belonging to the metaphysics of the past, a barren desert from which we have escaped into a living faith, or a region of arid understanding from which we have raised ourselves into the warm feeling of religion. The attempt to renovate by means of new applications and artifices of a clever understanding those rotten props that pass for proofs of our conviction that there is a God, or to strengthen the places that have become weak through attacks and counter-proofs, could of itself gain no favor by its good intention. For it is not this or that proof, or this or that form and mode of proof, that has lost its weight. Rather, the proving of religious truth as such has so much lost credit with the way of thinking of our time that the impossibility of such proof is already a generally accepted opinion. Indeed, more, it is regarded as irreligious to place confidence in such knowledge, and in this way to seek conviction regarding God and God's nature, or even merely God's being. This matter of proving is thus so much out of date that the proofs are barely even historically known here and there, and even to theologians who supposedly desire to have a scientific acquaintance with religious truths, they are sometimes unknown. Faith and reason. The proofs of the existence of God have arisen out of the necessity of satisfying thought and reason. But this necessity has assumed in modern culture quite a different position than it had formerly, and the points of view must first be mentioned that have presented themselves in this regard. Yet, since they are known in their general aspects, and since this is not the place to trace them back to their foundations, it is sufficient immediately to recall them, and indeed to limit ourselves to the form that they assume within the sphere of Christianity. It is in this sphere that the conflict between faith and reason, humanity itself, first comes about, and that doubt enters into the human spirit and can reach the fearful height of depriving a person of all peace. Thought must indeed touch the earlier regions of imagination, as we may briefly designate them. It must turn itself with its opposition directly against their sensible shapes and further content. The contradictions, strife, and enmity that have thus arisen belong to the external history of philosophy. But the collisions in this sphere develop only into hostility, not into an inner rupture of spirit and soul, as occurs within Christianity, where the two sides that come into contradiction obtain to the depth of spirit as their single and thus common source. In this position, bound together in their contradiction, they are able to disrupt this place itself, the spirit in its innermost nature. The expression faith is reserved to the Christian religion. We do not speak of a Greek or Egyptian faith, or a faith in Zeus or Apis. Faith expresses the inwardness of certainty, indeed certainty of the deepest and most concentrated kind, as distinguished from all other forms of opinion, representation, conviction, and volition. This inwardness, as at once what is deepest and most abstract, comprises thought itself. That's a good thing to highlight and keep in mind. A contradiction of this faith by thought is therefore the most painful of all divisions in the depths of spirit. So this is just a guess of mine, reading into this without much context. The reason why faith and thought would have an identity in their deepest sense is you could probably trace back to there's that famous phrase in the New Testament. It's a quote by Jesus where he said, "Blessed are those who believe without seeing." Now, a lot of people interpret that as belief without evidence, and I also interpreted it that way for a long time. But then I got into Hegel. And it struck me that one of the ways you could probably interpret that is actually that faith is belief without seeing, not because of lacking evidence, but because what you're certain of is not any sense object.
Data, right?
Yeah, but it's not a sense object. What you're certain of is an internal object, immaterial, which could only be a thought.
What I think it's interesting to note here too is how Hegel will say that before Christianity, the hostility between religion and reason, religion and philosophy, was given in between two strands of people, right? Religious people and reasonable people. And that in the case of Christianity, this fight itself, this hostility itself, is internalized, right? So it happens within the same person. Its source is inwardness itself, right?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely on point. And this distinction, he says, the expression faith is reserved to the Christian religion. We do not speak of a Greek or Egyptian faith or a faith in Zeus or Apis. Not only do I think this is historically true, that this notion of faith really only comes up with Christianity, but it doesn't even make sense in prior religions than Christianity, really. Like it was not a matter of like, oh well, I gotta have faith in Zeus. The thought was, well, Zeus is there. He's gonna do what Zeus does, regardless of what I internally believe. So whether I believe in Zeus or not, things are objectively happening in the way that they are. The same way with the Egyptian faith.
Yeah,
with Egyptian
there is also
religion.
there's also this that, like, to have faith, you need to have a recognized subjectivity, interiority, inwardness, right? And one thing it is important to know is that most ancient religions didn't recognize any rights to the interiority, to inwardness whatsoever. People were exterior to themselves, and they were considered as such. It's important to know this, why Christianity is such a religion that it affirms subjectivity. And the main reason for that, in my perspective, is that Christianity takes free will and autonomy as a central piece of its cosmology, right? You don't have free will, freedom as a central concept in any other religion before Christianity, right? The idea that you have an inwardness which is not reduced simply to external determinations, right? Determination from the outside, and that you actually have a certain autonomy or certain capability of not only reacting to what comes to you from the outside, but also having possibility of a true action, which means an action which cannot simply be reduced to any mechanical or neither organical explanation.
Yes. Then also to add to this whole topic, another, like, one way to see how this identity can work between faith and thought is like to look at two possible examples. One example would be the person of religious faith. They have the faith that God is real, that there is purpose to the world, that there is purpose to their life, that God has a plan, and so on. For these people, this is not just a belief like any other, and it's not just a conviction. It's not just like, oh, I really have a determination to believe in this because there's some kind of given end towards which I want to achieve or whatever. This is the foundation of the very concept of the world. This is as deep as you can get within the human cognitive, thoughtful psyche. This is the very concept of the world. This is metaphysics as such. If you destroy that, it destroys a person. This is why people who have crisis faith, crises of faith, are thrown into shambles.
Yeah, like the idea that the world has a aim, right, or a finality, that your actions can or cannot contribute for this universal finality, which is the realization of God Himself and the world, is a very, 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 very strange conception for contemporary people who are mostly represent themselves as these atomistic entities which are only concerned to their own finite ends in the world, like getting a career, getting money, or getting sex, or getting status, etc., without any consideration for a universal end which surpasses their own finite particular ends. So one thing to keep in mind here, we are talking about people who actually believed that there is a teleological aspect to the world, that the world can be through our own daily basis actions can be realizing the a certain ultimate end, right? This is very important to understand. So what I'm trying to say is very true. When you take that out of people, you get nihilists, people for whom the concept of theology itself cannot be applied neither to life nor to the world, nor to and the idea that there is a universal end to which each in particular action of yours would contribute to realize, etc. This kind of thinking is rather strange and very difficult to understand in our nihilistic age, right? And I think this is one of the reasons that people don't get the importance of metaphysics. People don't get metaphysics at all because of that, because they never lived or they never conceived of a time in which people actually thought in terms of ultimate causes, final causes, right?
Certainly. Yeah. The second example I wanted to bring up about this is not a religious person, but just an everyday person. You know, if you're an everyday person, you have an everyday life, and you're used to certain things being the way that they are, and you believe that you have reasons for things being the way that they are, and that you understand it, and that it makes sense the world is as it is. If for whatever reason your experience of the world starts changing, and it starts changing radically, it also destroys you. You start feeling crazy. Things stop making sense, and you don't know how to situate yourself in the world anymore. You know, for example, suppose you are going crazy. Suppose you're starting to hallucinate things and whatever. It starts getting extremely hard for you to figure out what is real and what is not. And your very faith in like the very practical reality of everydayness falls apart because you can't tell anymore, like how to situate yourself in the world. What is real? What is not? Who is a real person you're talking to? Who is not? What's really going on? A more mundane example would just be Hegel. Hegel, in a way, destroys an everyday kind of faith that people have, and it bothers them. I know this is true because I've seen plenty of examples of people for whom this kind of thought is extremely bothersome. They're used to, like, things are as they are, things work as they work. You cannot come and tell me that being is nothing. You cannot come and tell me that the finite is infinite and the infinite is finite. These two things are by definition separate. And if you start asking me to start seeing that these are actually fudged definitions, I don't know how to think anymore. I'm lost, and that's how they feel. Rightly so.
Yeah. Yeah, Hegel, including that, like adding to that, Hegel uses metaphors of violence to refer to this shattering of the certainties of the understanding. That right, like speculative reasons make violence to the understanding. Just so you know, guys, if you are not, some of you are not familiar with the difference between understanding and reason in Hegel. The general idea is that the understanding will fix itself in a certain part of a categorical dichotomy, right? Being or nothing. So there will be people who are fixed in being, in the abstract category of being. There are people who are going to cling for nothing, or you can also think about that when you think of something and other. People who will try to conceive of otherness without something, or something without otherness, etc., etc., etc. So this faculty of human thinking, which is understanding, is actually obsessed with abstractness, which is separateness between those, let's say, spectrums, not spectrum, but those categorical dichotomies. And reason would be a faculty which actually sees the unity and the concreteness of these contraries or these dichotomies.
Yep, and it can deal with its fluidities.
I feel like the way I've tended to think about reason a lot is like if logic is sort of the order or movement of stuff, almost sort of like the form of things. I tend to think of reason as the thought, like the force of thought that kind of like moves through that. If that makes sense. That's how I've generally conceptualized reason. But I don't know like how consistent that would be with the Hegelian notion of reason.
It's consistent enough. Anyways, let's keep
Let's
moving.
go to the text.
So continuing, yet such unhappiness is happily, if we may so express ourselves, not the only form in which the relationship of faith and thought is to be found. By contrast, this relationship presents itself in a peaceful form in the conviction that revelation of faith, positive religion, and, on the other side, reason and thought as such, must not be in contradiction. Indeed, not only can they exist in harmony, but also God, in God's works, does not contradict God's self, cannot so contradict God's self that the human spirit in its essential nature is thinking reason, in that which it must have come to regard as divine in itself from the very beginning, could come into conflict with what has come to it through greater enlightenment about the nature of God in the relationship of humanity to the divine nature. So this certainly links to the Platonic idealist tradition, which obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, people around the world have different knowledge, but for those of you who don't know, Christianity definitely had a huge Platonic influence at its inception, through Paul specifically, which led to some very, very interesting things. During the whole of the Middle Ages, theology was understood to mean nothing other than a scientific knowledge of Christian truths, that is, a knowledge essentially connected with philosophy. The Middle Ages were far away from regarding the historical knowledge of faith as a science. In the Church Fathers and in what generally may be taken as historical material, they sought only authorities, edification, and instruction on the doctrines of the Church. The opposite direction is to search out the human origin of the doctrines of faith by means of the historical treatment of the older evidences in works of every kind, and in this way to reduce them to the minimum of their earliest form. This form would contradict the spirit poured out on the adherents of those doctrines once the immediacy of their presence to them has been removed, for the sake of leading them now, for the first time, into all truth. This historicizing tendency must be regarded as unfruitful for the development of ever deeper knowledge, and was completely unknown in earlier times. In the belief in the unity of the Spirit with itself, all the doctrines, even those that are the most abstruse for reason, are regarded from the point of view of thinking, and the attempt is made in the case of all those that adhere on the content of faith to prove them on rational grounds. The great theologian Anselm of Canterbury, whom we shall have to consider elsewhere, declares in this sense that if we are firm in faith, it is negligence not to know what we believe. I suppose that was a quote in Latin, negligentiae mihi esse iberi videtur.
General idea here is that in Middle Ages, the Christian God, as historically it was represented, was taken as an object of an attempt of scientific justification for the fathers of the church, right? So you have these doctrines, and instead of trying to derive them from a certain fundamental principle, you are actually trying to actively prove them, to show that they are not only truth to faith itself, to our inward conviction in these doctrines, nor immediate inner conviction in these doctrines, but that they also can all be understood, right? You can see through their reasons. You can give reasons for them, right?
Yes. Another thing that's just to go over this.
it looks like a bit of today's journalism. You have a certain agenda, and you try to prove it through reason and historical gathering and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, except this was like philosophical, metaphysical reasons, so it wasn't like what people think people were doing at that time. Well, people today.
It was just a joke.
No, yeah.
Just joking.
Yeah, but I don't think people are aware of this, or at least not enough people are aware of this, in which, at least the early church, the very people who are called the church fathers, they did not take this stuff. They did not take the books of the Bible. They did not take the Old Testament as literal historical truths. What Hegel says about this here is fairly true to what the vast majority of them were doing, which is they were interested in the philosophical content, the metaphysical content of what this said, not just about God, because God and the world were not these distinct, completely, utterly separate entities for them either. And so they were interested in the, what Hegel says, they sought only authorities, edification, instruction of the doctrines of the church. So, insofar as they were trying to do anything, it was just simply to justify the church through reason, as opposed to justify the church based on merely historical antecedent or whatever. Certainly that happens today.
Search and effect.
Yeah, certainly I think afterwards, plenty of people went the complete opposite direction, and they interpreted the works as actual history and tried to prove things based on an assumption of that actual history. Like the age of the earth and whatnot and so on. But that's not of any interest in theological matters of this kind. And then Hegel says that the historicizing tendency must be regarded as unfruitful. And here I think this is a direct critique of what at least people claim Spinoza inaugurated, where Spinoza says, well, let's look at these historical claims and, do they even make sense? So there was a objective historical analysis of the Bible, the biblical works. There's also a more valid one about which, he just pointed out the internal contradictions of the Bible, both Old Testament, New Testament, which is at least amenable to theological reasoning, insofar as revelation is not to be taken as some kind of absolute ground. But basically, what biblical research has become nowadays, Hegel has no interest in. Continuing. In the Protestant Church, it has in the same way come about that in connection with theology, or along with it, the rational knowledge of religious truths is cherished and honored. The point of interest was to determine how far the natural light of reason, human reason by itself, could progress in knowledge of truth, with the important proviso that through religion humans could learn higher truths than reason is in a position to discover from itself. Unfortunately, the Protestant churches have far regressed from this high standpoint which they had near to Hegel's days. That's where we find most of our literalists nowadays. By the way, there's this great lecture by Paul Redding on the relationship of Hegel to Martin Luther. And it's mostly a discussion on Luther's philosophy of free will, and goddamn, Luther has some fire things to say, which just show like the guy was intelligent in the highest degree. It's very interesting. Footnote 5. Hegel is apparently alluding to the fact that the doctrine of natural light, going back to antiquity and renewed by Descartes, had an effect on Protestant hermeneutics through the influence of Lord Herbert of Cherbury, as well as Leibniz and Wolff. For this, hermeneutics had to relinquish a foundation based on tradition and teaching office. All right. Here, two distinct spheres present themselves, and initially a peaceful relationship between them is justified by the distinction that the doctrines of positive religion are above but not against reason. This activity of disciplined thinking found itself externally stimulated and supported by the example that lay before its eyes in the pre-Christian, or more generally, the non-Christian religions, namely, that the human spirit, even on its own, has attained to deep insight into the nature of God, and with all its errors has arrived at great truths, even fundamental truths such as the existence of God, and the pure idea free from sensible ingredients of that existence, the immortality of the soul, providence, etc. Thus positive doctrine and the rational knowledge of religious truths have been peacefully pursued alongside one another. This position of reason in relation to dogmatics was, however, different from that confidence of reason mentioned above, which dared to approach the highest mysteries of doctrine, such as the Trinity and the Incarnation of Christ. By contrast, the point of view just described timidly confined itself to venturing by means of thought to deal with what the Christian religion has in common with the pagan and non-Christian religions, and what must therefore remain merely abstract in religion. So clearly that's talking about the history of the amicability between philosophy and religion during the Middle Ages, in which Plato and Aristotle and certain non-Christians were accepted on the basis that what was in their teachings was not entirely alien or contrary to the doctrines of the Church.
But there is a tension here, because Christianity is by excellence the religion of revelation, right? So why would revelation be something important if human beings could get to the same truths to the natural light of reason, through pure reason alone, right? Why would God reveals itself through Christianity, through the word of Christ, if human beings could come up with the same doctrines, only thinking reason itself, right? Through logic. So it's interesting that even though there is this attempt to give a scientific treatment to the doctrines of revelation, the revealed relation, the positive relation, there is also this tension which will never go away between the idea that the revelation is necessary and the idea that it is possible to come up with the same ideas through reasoning alone.
Yep. But once we have become conscious of the diversity of these two spheres, we must judge such a relationship of indifference, in which faith and reason are seen to stand alongside each other, to be unintelligible or a misleading pretense. The drive of thought toward unity leads of necessity first to the comparison of the two spheres, and then, once they are regarded as diverse, to the agreement of faith only with itself and of thought only with itself, so that each sphere refuses to recognize the other and rejects it. One of the commonest deceptions of the understanding is not to regard the element of diversity that is present in the one center of spirit to be necessarily advancing to opposition and thus to contradiction. The basis for the initial conflict of spirit is established as soon as what is concrete in spirit has, by means of analysis, attained to the consciousness of difference. Everything spiritual is concrete. Here we have before us the spiritual in its most profound aspect, namely spirit as the concreteness of faith and thought. These two are not only mixed in the most manifold fashion, immediately passing over from one to the other, they are also so inwardly bound together that there is no faith that does not contain within itself reflection, argumentation, or in fact thought, just as there is no thought that does not contain within itself faith, at least momentarily. For faith is as such the form of any sort of presupposition, of any assumption, wherever it originates, that lies at the basis of thought. This is a momentary faith, which means that in free thought, that which is now a presupposition becomes a comprehended result, thought out either after or before. This transformation of presupposition into result again has an aspect of presupposition, namely the assumption or the unconscious immediacy of the activity of spirit.
This part is very, very, very interesting. One thing that we could concretely refer to talk about faith in thought is that, take for instance our scientific zeitgeist. What is happening right now? We know that people think that thinking alone has no content whatsoever. So thinking needs a certain content from the outside to fulfill it, so it can be able to think. Perfect. The way they do that, scientists do that, is through pure and simple observation, right? So the idea is that what can validate, or what can be shown to validate a certain content of a certain proposition, scientific proposition, is the testimony of our eyes and ears, etc., or in general experience itself, right? But the thing is that underlying every scientific research, there is some fundamental ideas which cannot be given in experience itself, such as the homogeneity of nature, right? Or the idea that nature is, in all its extension, subordinated or submitted to laws, right? Observation cannot testimony for these affirmations, because observation can only grasp the particular, can only grasp the singular, the individual, and in that sense, these premises of scientific research, such as the effectiveness of causality itself, the homogeneity of nature, etc., they are articles of faith, because they cannot empirically be proven through observation, right? So there is this moment of faith within thought itself in this example.
Yeah, that would count. I think the more direct point is just that at the beginning of any inquiry, we take on that inquiry with faith, one, that our beginning can yield anything, regardless.
Yeah. That's also an aspect of it.
And two, that we think there is such a thing to be sought within the medium that we're attempting. If one had no faith in thought, one would not bother reasoning at all.
Yeah. The idea that there is reasonableness in the world is also a certain faith, only a faith in the beginning of any research, right? We can get back to it after the research is done and see that which was a premise, that which was an article of faith, to be actually an article of reason, right? But still, if you think about any empirical research, there is also premises based on the limits of the object you are starting with, right? Because this object is not a result of your research, is a presupposition within your research, which enables the beginning of any research. Because if you don't have a particular determination for the object you are researching, if you don't have an object or a determinate object, you have no research, right? So this object also appears as a premise.
Yeah, and you also have to believe, you have to have faith that it is an object. Because there's plenty of stuff that is objects, which people don't have faith in.
that
Right.
exist, right? Yeah.
Yeah, stuff that we're like,
Like
oh, they're
the
like,
Freudian consciousness.
yeah, there you go. Like consciousness is a good example in which something that some people just have no faith in it, and they're like, oh, that's not even a thing. They don't even bother researching it. They just assume, whatever. Here's a favorite issue of mine: UFOs.
Yeah.
Even though there is data and information, there's plenty of people who have no faith that these are actual data of information of anything. So they don't bother looking at it. They don't bother like going and researching it, because like, why would they research something that they don't think is real to begin with? If it's data, oh well, it's all just explained away. It's just people making shit up. It's just mechanical malfunctions of reading instruments. Easy peasy. No need to look into it.
Yeah.
Continuing. Yet we must here leave aside the explanation of the nature of free thought existing for itself, and remark rather that for the attainment of the union in and for itself of faith and thought a long period of time has been necessary, more than 1,500 years in fact, and that it has cost the most severe toil to reach the point at which thought has escaped from its absorption into faith and attained to the abstract consciousness of its freedom, to the consciousness of its independence and its complete self-sufficiency, in the light of which nothing can have validity of for thought any longer that has not come before its judgment seat and be justified there as admissible. Thought thus taking its stand at the extremity of its freedom, and that is completely free only at this extremity, and thereby rejecting authority and faith in general, has driven faith in like manner to take its stand upon itself in an equally abstract fashion, and to attempt to free itself entirely from thought. In any event, it has arrived at the point of declaring itself to be freed from, and not to require thought. Unaware of the small amount of thought that nonetheless must remain to it, it goes on to declare thought to be incapable of reaching truth and destructive of it. Thought supposedly is capable of comprehending one thing only, its incapacity to grasp the truth and see into it, and of proving to itself its own nothingness, with the result that suicide is its highest calling. In the view of the present time, the relation has been so completely reversed that faith is now exalted as immediate knowledge against thought, and as the only means of attaining to the truth, just as in former times the only thing that could give peace to human beings was that truth of which they might become aware through proof by thought. The standpoint of opposition cannot be any more important and far-reaching than in relation to the subject that we have set ourselves to discuss, the knowledge of God. In the elaboration of the difference between faith and thought into opposition, it is immediately evident that they have reached formal extremes in which all content is abstracted, so that they no longer are opposed as concretely defined religious faith and thought about religious objects, but abstractly as faith in general and thought in general, or as knowledge insofar as the latter does not yield merely forms of thought, but gives us a content in and with its truth. From this point of view, the knowledge of God is made to depend on the question of the nature of knowledge in general. And before we can move to the investigation of the concrete, it seems necessary to ascertain whether the consciousness of the true can and must be cognitive thought or faith. Our proposed consideration of the knowledge of the being of God is thus transformed into a general consideration of knowledge, just as the new philosophical epoch has made it the beginning and foundation of all philosophizing, that the nature of knowledge itself is to be investigated before the actual, that is, concrete knowledge of an object. We thus run the danger, necessary for the sake of thoroughness, of having to go further back in our investigations than the time allotted for these lectures will allow. If, however, we look more closely at the demand that appears to have been put before us, it becomes perfectly obvious that it is only the object that has changed with this demand, and not the matter itself. In either case, if we either admit to the demand for that inquiry or adhere directly to our theme, we should have to know, and in that case we should also have an object, namely knowledge itself. And since in so doing we should not have emerged from the activity of knowledge, from actual knowledge, there is nothing to hinder our leaving the other object alone, which it is not our aim to consider, and to stick with our own. It will further appear, as we pursue our purpose, that the knowledge of our object will also in itself justify itself as knowledge, that the justification of knowledge will and must lie in true and actual knowledge. Okay, sorry, that's trying to make sense of that sentence. Oh, okay.
Yeah, the text is a bit fucked up.
That the justification of knowledge will and must lie in true and actual knowledge might admittedly be said in advance, for to say so is simply a tautology. Just as we may also know in advance that the desired detour, the desire to know knowledge before actual knowledge, is superfluous just because it is inherently absurd. If under the procedure of knowledge we imagine an external operation in which it is brought into a merely mechanical relationship with its object, that is, remains foreign to it and is only externally applied to it, then in such a relationship knowledge is presented as a particular affair for itself, so that its forms have nothing in common with the qualities of the object. Thus, when it concerns itself with an object, it merely remains within its own forms and does not reach the qualities of the object. That is, it does not become an actual knowledge of it. Through such a relationship, knowledge is determined as finite and of the finite. In its object there remains something essentially inner, whose concept is unattainable by and foreign to it. Here knowledge finds its limit and its end, and is therefore limited and finite. But to take such a relationship as the sole, final, and absolute one is a purely fabricated and unjustified assumption of the understanding. Actual knowledge, insofar as it does not remain outside the object, but in fact occupies itself with it, must be immanent to the object, the proper movement of its nature, only expressed in the form of thought and taken up into consciousness. Alright, end of lecture 1. That was just a pretty good and quick rundown of his argument against epistemology as such, particularly Kantian foundational epistemology.
Yeah. I think we if you puts it in a very nice formula, the demand of transcendental philosophy is to investigate thinking that thinks objects, right? So the thinking of objectivity itself before any actual knowledge, right? So it is an investigation of a certain thinking of objects. But this demand implies that we should, in a sense, be checking our tools before using them, right? The problem is that by thinking the thinking of objects, transcendental philosophy ignores the thinking of objects, if you know what I mean. I don't know if I expressed me very well right there, but yeah. I think you get it. So there is this dimension of the research which is not explicited, which is the thinking that is thinking, the thinking of objects, is not the same thinking of the thinking of objects, right? So if the demand is to actually make a critique of thinking before using it, before applying it to actual knowledge, to result in actual knowledge, then this demand goes unfulfilled, because there is a certain thinking which is not being investigated there, because those two thinkings are different from each other, right?
Yeah. There is a thinking, or in this case knowing, operating, which is not the same as the one that's being investigated. Therefore, to say, oh, we have critiqued knowledge as such, or reason as such, is nonsense, because clearly you haven't critiqued that higher order reasoning that you're using.
Yeah. Exactly.
So he also gave a quick rundown of how the issues in theology led to the birth of modern Enlightenment science. saying how the issues of epistemology of knowing God became just the issues of epistemology in general, how the issues of the ontology became issues of ontology in general. Which is just one of those ways in which I think people don't appreciate how modernity, even in a colloquial sense, not even a Hegelian sense, but just modernity as we understand it as, this scientific enlightenment, would not happen were it not for religion. The idea that religion is what held thought back for so long. If you ever seen that stupid graph of the development of supposedly the development of science, and then it drops down for 1,000 years into these are the dark ages, and it skyrockets after the dark ages end, and that somehow this was because of the suppression of reason or whatever. And had it not been for the Catholic Church, we would all be living in space or Mars nowadays. It's a completely stupid idea. Historically ignorant idea. So there's an example of how faith and knowledge have gone historically hand in hand. Had we not had faith, we would not have knowledge. It's that simple. Anyways, let's go on to the next lecture. The elevation of the human spirit to God. We have now preliminarily indicated those standpoints of culture that in the present day need to be taken into account in regard to the sort of material that we have before us. That what has been said, namely, that the consideration of knowledge is not different from the consideration of the nature of its object, must hold good without limitation, is self-evident in this material especially, or better, in it alone. I will therefore at once indicate the general sense in which the proposed theme, the proofs of the existence of God, is taken, and which will be shown to be the true one. This sense is that proofs should compromise the elevation of the human spirit to God and should express it for thought, how the elevation itself is an elevation of thought into the kingdom of thought. To begin with, in regard to knowledge generally, the human being is essentially consciousness. Thus, what is felt, the content, the determinateness that a feeling or sensation has, is also in consciousness as something represented. That in virtue of which the feeling is a religious feeling is the divine content. It is, therefore, essentially something that we know. But this content is, in its essence, no sensible intuition or sensible representation. It does not exist for imagination, but only for thought. God is spirit, only for spirit, and only for pure spirit, that is, for thought. This is the root of such a content, even though imagination and even intuition may afterwards accompany it, and this content may enter into feeling or sensation. It is this elevation of the thinking spirit to that which is itself the highest thought, to God, that we thus wish to consider. Just let me read the beginning of this. To begin with, in regard to knowledge generally, the human being is essentially consciousness. Thus, what is felt, the content, the determinateness that a feeling or sensation has, is also in consciousness as something represented. That in virtue of which the feeling is a religious feeling is the divine content. It is therefore essentially something that we know. But this content is in its essence no sensible intuition or sensible representation. It does not exist for imagination, but only for thought. Okay, this is something interesting, of course.
There is a feeling, but it is a feeling of something which is not sensible at all, right?
Yeah. And there's why the necessary identity with thought has to be the case, because it's not a sense object. How are you going to behold it? It's not an imagination, so it's not even a represented sense object. and though we have a feeling towards it, it is not that feeling. So it's not a psychic object either. It's not an object of feeling, imagination.
It can appear in the form of feeling, but it is not an object of intuition or even imagination. It is imageless.
Yeah, which means that the only thing it could be an object of, or an object of the kind, is thought.
Of thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This elevation is, moreover, essentially rooted in the nature of our spirit. It is necessary to it, and it is this necessity that we have before us in this elevation. The portrayal of this necessity itself is nothing other than what we call proof. Therefore, we do not have to prove this elevation from the outside. It proves itself in itself, and this means nothing other than that it is by its very nature necessary. We have only to look to its own process, and since it is a necessary process, we have therein the necessity itself, insight into the nature of which has to be secured by proof. Okay, this was the end of the first lecture. This is the second lecture. Alright, the real second lecture. If the undertaking that is commonly called proof of the existence of God has been understood as it was set forth in the first lecture, the chief objection to it will have been eliminated. For proof was held to consist in this, that it is only the consciousness of the proper movement of the object in itself. If this idea might have difficulties in its application to other objects, these difficulties must necessarily disappear in the case of the object with which we are concerned. For the latter is not a passive object, but really a subjective movement, the elevation of the spirit to God. It is an activity, a course of action, a process, and thus it has in it that necessary movement which constitutes proof and only needs to be taken up and studied in order that it may be seen to involve proof. But the expression proof carries with it too definitely the impression of a merely subjective procedure followed on our own behalf to allow the just indicated conception of it to be considered sufficient in itself without any attempt to examine and eliminate the contrasting impression. In this lecture, therefore, we must first come to an understanding of proof in general, and with special attention to that aspect of it that we here set aside and exclude. It is not our business to assert that there is no proof of this kind, but to assign its limit and to see that it is not, as falsely supposed, the only form of proof. This is connected with the contrast between immediate and mediated knowledge, a contrast that in our time chiefly centers on religious knowledge and indeed religiousness as such, and that accordingly must also be considered. So the subjective proof he's talking about here is, guess what? There's only one well-established scientific domain that uses the term proof for what it does: mathematics and geometry. How dare Hegel say that proofs in this domain are subjective? I mean, isn't that the highest objectivity we know of, Pedro? How can this be?
Yeah.
Well, part of it is empirically speaking. You could just look up what the current state of mathematics is, particularly the state of mathematics after about the 1850s, in which the idea of an objective mathematics completely got thrown out the window due to the revolutions of how,
non-Euclidean geometry.
Yeah, the non-Euclidean geometry revolution, the logic revolution.
Of millennia-old axiomatics geometry, like axioms. I mean.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that was a huge part of it.
They simply they've seen that. One way of putting it is that, for instance, geometry, it deals with space, right? But a space appears in geometry as something which is subjectively posited in its existence. It is not shown within geometry itself. The process of derivation of space from simpler, more abstract entities. That right? So the idea is that I think the idea here is that geometry does not get into objectivity because its beginning is arbitrary and subjective. I think there is also this aspect here, right?
Yeah, that's the subjective aspect, that axioms can be whatever the hell you want. The only necessity is that they be consistent with each other.
Yeah.
And mathematics has
maybe
taken that a long
what
way.
afterwards is done with these axioms have a certain intersubjective necessity. But all this necessity is founded in this initial arbitrary move of establishing those axioms as premises for thinking.
Yep. So, subjective proof and finite knowledge. The distinction that has already been touched upon in regard to knowledge implies that two kinds of proof must be taken into account, of which the one is clearly that which we use as an aid to knowledge, as something subjective, whose activity and movement have their place only within ourselves, and are not the proper movement of the thing considered. That this kind of proof finds a place in the scientific knowledge of finite things and their finite content becomes apparent when we examine the nature of the procedure more closely. We shall take for this purpose an example from a science in which this method of proof is admittedly applied in its most complete form. If we prove a geometrical theorem, every part of the proof must in part carry justification within itself. So also when we solve an algebraic equation. In part, however, the whole procedure is defined and justified to the purpose that we have in connection with it, and because our purpose is attained by such procedure. But we are very well aware that the object whose quantitative value has been developed out of these equations has not as an actual thing run through these operations in order to reach the quantity that it possesses, and that the magnitude of the geometrical lines, angles, etc. has not gone through and been brought about by the series of definitions by which we have arrived.
Yeah, they are external. Like the magnitudes themselves are external.
Not only the magnitudes, like here what he's saying is that the very construction of theorems, not even axioms, but theorems themselves, is completely subjective in that the theorems don't build themselves. You have lines, you have angles, you have arcs.
And you need a subjective purpose, right? To make things go in.
Yeah, so you have lines, you have angles, you have arcs. What are you going to do? Well, you could construct triangles with the lines. Will the lines construct themselves into a triangle? No. Will the angles construct themselves into anything? No.
Yeah.
Will the arcs construct themselves into anything? No.
Yeah, that makes totally sense. Like the axioms, they are simply dead and fixed, right? They need a certain subjective external action to be able to result into something, right? You cannot simply derive the triangle from the axioms. The axioms simply state the basic properties of the entities which will be used by a subject, right, to construct these geometrical forms, right? But also, I think his comment on the arbitrariness of the magnitudes of geometrical lines, angles, etc., is very interesting, right? They cannot be deduced from the simple affirmation that only a line passes through a point, right? That you can look around all the axioms, and then that a point is something which has no dimension and stuff like that. You cannot derive any particular magnitude for your forms out of that. Not even the constructs themselves, but it's interesting to see how the construct and the magnitudes are not something which are the result of a immanent development departing from the axioms, right? They are arbitrary. They are applied from the outside. So they need this subjectivity to exist, to become.
And a perfect example would be the Pythagorean triangle, or right triangle, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. This defines a triangle. What the actual number, the magnitude of a or b or c, is completely arbitrary. It is not inherent to that entity at all.
Now, it's formal, right?
Yeah, it's formal.
It's external to that form.
Yeah, and by the way, that equation Hegel considers to be a speculative mathematical form. The a squared plus b squared equals c squared. He thinks that it's one of the few examples where we may say that this is an actual mathematical concept. Of course, it's not a purely mathematical concept, it's a geometrical one, but that and the derivation of the circle through the radian, through the hypotenuse of the triangle, is also a speculative mathematical concept for him. Because those, regardless of what it is that you might have in any definitional system whatsoever, a triangle is a triangle, regardless of the internal angles add up to 180 or I think 270 on a 3D whatever curved space. It doesn't matter. Triangles have certain relationships no matter what. Circles also have certain relationships no matter what. So anyways, continuing. The necessity we see in such proofs corresponds...
that we see.
We see in such proofs corresponds indeed to the individual properties of the object itself, these relations of quantity actually belonging to it. But the progression in connecting the one with the other goes on entirely within us. It is a process for realizing our purpose of gaining insight, and not a course in which the object arrives at its intrinsic relations and their connections. It thus does not create itself, and is not created. Rather, we create it and its relations in the process of attaining insight into it. The emphasis on self-creation, an analog of self-determination.
Yeah.
In addition to proof in the proper sense, of which the essential characteristic has been brought out, and this is all that is necessary for the purpose of our investigation, we find further in the region of finite knowledge the term proof is also applied to what is more precisely an indicating, pointing out of a representation, a proposition, a law, and so on in experience. For the point of view from which we are here considering knowledge, we do not need to elaborate in detail historical proof. It depends for its material on experience, or rather, perception. In one respect, it makes no difference that it refers to unfamiliar perceptions and their evidences, argumentation, the exercise of understanding proper regarding the objective connection of circumstances and actions, makes these data into presuppositions and assumptions, just as its criticism of evidences has done in drawing its conclusions. But insofar as argument and criticism constitute the other essential side of historical proof, such proof treats its data as the representations of other people. The subjective element enters directly into the material, and the reasoning about and combination of that material is likewise subjective activity. As a result, the course and activity of historical knowledge has quite different ingredients than the course of the events themselves. Alright, he's not pulling any punches here. Destroying all the beliefs and objectivities that people have. Like, what do you mean we don't know? What do you mean history's subjective? Well, were you there? Even if you were, you don't know what the fuck was going on. You had a small little glimpse. You had a small little glimpse of what was happening in the historical moment. The rest of it is just hearsay. You believe other people. You trust, you have faith in the data you're provided. I mean, there's a reason we say history is written by the winners.
One interesting thing here is how the insistence on the necessity of every aspect of a certain scientific progression, even the delimitation of the object in the beginning, right? Like even the method of progression itself must be necessitated, must not be presupposed. It's interesting how this demand of necessity throughout all the procedures common to science leads us to see that only a self-determining entity can correspond to those demands, right? So only a free entity is able to be uh, exposed in all its necessity. It's a beautiful dialectical move, right?
Yeah, only a free subject could be an absolute object.
Yeah, object, an absolute guy can also be understood for you guys who doesn't get much of the Paul Lapierre, Hegelian Paul Lapierre. Absolute is that which doesn't need to refer to anything else outside of itself to be. It is independent, right? It has all its conditions within itself. For example, when you say that your knowledge is relative, it means that your knowledge depends on certain things that your knowledge itself is not able to explicate. Take, for instance, the problem in mathematics that a mathematical system cannot prove its own coherence within itself, right? Cannot justify its own initial assumptions within itself. So it's not absolute because it necessitates something out of it to be able to operate. Some assumptions take geometry. Space itself is not derived within geometry. Space is an entity which is assumed in the beginning. So geometry is not an absolute discipline because it refers to something for its existence and operations. It refers to something which is out of itself. Just to try to clarify a bit to the listeners, maybe you are getting into this discussion, very strange discussion, uh, like not long, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you,
Right,
Pedro.
Josh?
Yeah.
Yeah, Josh agrees with me. I'm fine with that.
Thank you for that, Pedro. Yeah, that's exactly what I would say in short an absolute is. And
Yeah.
one of the qualities of Hegelianism is it deals and it cares only about absolutes. Like if so, things like what he's talking about. These, he calls it here arguments. What is it? Argumentation, the exercise of understanding proper regarding the objective connection of circumstances and actions. He's saying this is subjective stuff. We don't care about that here. Hegelianism doesn't care about arguments of this sort. Debate is not in question here.
Yeah, it's interesting because he has some remarks throughout his work about argumentative people, right? And when you understand what is at stake in a truly scientific cognition, you understand that there is no such a thing as more unphilosophical, well, maybe feeling peoples, but argumentative people are basically people who, like, out of caprice, take some premises, get some conclusions out of the premises. They have different premises, they have different principles, and they simply show up in a place or the internet, and they pit their premises and results against one another. And who wins? Who is more able to provoke pathetic in the most ancient meaning of this word, meaning pathos, in the public? So argumentative people are not philosophical at all. Argumentative people, they're actually, it's very difficult to make argumentative people to get into philosophy. They think they're doing philosophy. They think they're thinking, but what they're actually doing is simply mechanically deriving some results from some preferred premises they have and going about trying to impose that dogmatically, by the way, because those premises are simply asserted on other people, right? So debates are pretty stupid most of the time, right?
Yep.
I don't like argumentative people. I really don't. I think that's the pathos of heuristics, like in a Aristotelian kind of way, or kind of saying, right, Josh?
Yep. You can make Josh.
Yeah, why
Josh?
do you have to keep pulling me into this? I'm listening.
Sorry, Josh. Sorry.
Speaking of argumentative people, I banned. Yeah, it's the only person I've ever banned from this server. I banned him earlier today. Some guy who just
Noob Slayer?
wouldn't get the message. Yeah.
He was
Are you
trying to
recording this?
slay you, man.
Wait, are you recording this?
Yes, Josh.
Oh my god.
Let's get it on. Come on.
We're
let's get
reading.
it on.
We're always recording.
I will not call out for Josh anymore. He don't want to expose himself on the internet. Okay, let's go.
As regards the indication of things in present experience, this is certainly concerned initially with individual perceptions, observations, etc., that is, with the sort of material that is only pointed out. But the interest in doing so is to prove further that there are in nature and spirit such genera and species, such laws, forces, faculties, and activities as are established in the sciences. We set aside the metaphysical or common psychological reflections about the subjective element of sense, external and internal, that accompanies perception. But the material, insofar as it enters into the sciences, is not left to itself as it is in the senses and perception. On the contrary, the content of the sciences, the genera, species, laws, forces, is built up out of that material, which is perhaps already designated by the term appearances or phenomena. It does so by means of putting together through analysis what is common and leaving aside what is not essential. What is called essential is retained without any certain criterion for distinguishing between the unessential and the essential. It is admitted that what is perceived does not itself make these abstractions, nor does not itself compare its individuals or individual positions, circumstances, etc., does not connect what is common in them, that therefore a greater portion of cognitive activity is a subjective affair, just as in the content that has been obtained some of its definitions, as logical forms, are the product of this subjective activity. The expression sign or mark, if one still wants to use this feeble expression, directly indicates a subjective purpose of isolating properties for our own marking, while others, which also exist in the object, are put aside. This expression is to be called feeble because the definitions of genera and species immediately pass for something essential and objective and not as existing merely for our marking.
This is a very interesting part, because when we are facing a certain object in representation, we are facing certain determinations, right? And how are we going to find in experience itself a certain criteria which allows us to distinguish between that which is essential to that object and that which is not, for those of you who doesn't get this point, is like, take for instance a glass of water, right? What is essential to a glass of water and what is not? Is it color? Of course not, because we can have like colors, glasses of water of many different colors and still be glasses of water, etc., etc. This is a very simple example, but it is important to take notice of this, because today's empirical researches usually they actually indulge very freely in this kind of mistake. You are going to study the family, for example, right? But to make an empirical research about the family, you need to have a certain initial concept of what family is. Otherwise, you won't have the capability of recognizing a family when you see one, right? The thing is, when we look at an empirical family, First, we are making the assumption that that grouping of people can actually be comprehended by the concept of family. So you are going to see a lot of determinations. Take, for example, the blood determination, right? Determination of cooperation between individuals, etc., etc., etc. So what will the social scientist do? He will arbitrarily choose one of two or three of these determinations, make the definition of family, and do empirical research in which the only entities in the world which are going to be studied are those which has those determinations. But the problem is, are those determinations really essential to a certain concept of family? Aren't you simply mistaking family for certain characteristics which are merely empirical and contingent, and basing your research on that? I think this is a interesting way of giving an example of what Hegel is talking about here. One thing about Hegel is that the thing is so attentive to these arbitrary movements that we usually take as obvious, in our daily living and even in the academia, that I think that I must call this out and show to you the kind of demand that's being made here. Like when you take a certain object in representation and you simply abstract or isolate certain determinations of it, um, uh, what you are doing is simply okay, I will take these preferred determinations, make them essential, say they're essential, assert they're essential, and then deal with the world based on that, deal with my research based on that. So, but that's not philosophy. That's argumentation.
Yeah, very good example. Another one that's more in line with the so-called hard sciences. There was this stuff for a long time that people called junk DNA, and they're like, well, there's a lot of it, but it doesn't do anything as far as we can tell. So we're just gonna ignore it, and it's unessential. Basically, it's just the body doesn't use it. It's not part of the genetic plan. And guess what? In the last decade, they've been finding out that junk DNA, it's probably not junk at all. It seems to have some very peculiar uses of which we were unaware of, that the body was making use of certain things in those seemingly throwaway codes in the genome. So that's a very good example of how utterly baseless our assumptions, which are always assumptions about what is essential and unessential in objects, is.
Yeah. Yeah. But still, just a remark here. I am not against empirical research, empirical science. I am in favor of it, but I think it should be accompanied by philosophy, And they think they're all fed from philosophy. Oh, it happened in the century, and philosophy is our motto, but we don't like philosophy because stuff. But they're always acting within bad philosophy. That's a problem. You cannot do a true research on family if you don't have a certain way of coming up with a normative concept of family. You cannot have a true and proper understanding of an empirical state if you don't have a way of coming up with a certain normative conception of the state. And most of the confusion that reigns nowadays in social sciences are derived from the ignorance, the utter ignorance those people have on the basic fundamental philosophical problems presented, especially by German idealism. So I am not against empirical research. I want to know how what's going on, but I don't want to know what is going on simply through the mediation of completely arbitrary and distorted concepts. Sometimes facts are interesting, but for what if you don't have an end?
I, for one, will disagree. I am against empirical sciences. I do not want evidence, people. You got a claim? I don't want to see your evidence. Go away.
No, because it's funny, because sometimes when I discuss with people, primarily social scientists, they are disparaged at my demands of scientific rigor, right? They're like, okay, so what am I going to do and stuff like that? How am I to begin and stuff like that? The first thing I say is read the fucking Science of Logic, and then I say, well, you can keep doing what you want, but you will have to understand that philosophy will need to always be there by your side, shitting on your head when it's necessary.
Yep. Yeah. Totally agree. I mean, and we don't even have to be like Hegelians about it, really. I'm willing to compromise. I'm willing to go as far as, like, just let's be open firebendians. Let's just have some epistemic openness.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. Yeah. It's like humble. Be humble. Sit down. Be humble.
Be humble but assertive. With reason. Alright, continuing. We may certainly also express ourselves by saying that the term genus leaves aside in one of its species properties that it places in another, or that force leaves aside in one of its expression circumstances that are present in another, that these circumstances are thus shown by it to be inessential, and that it of itself gives up its expression and withdraws into inactivity and inwardness. We may also say, for example, that the law of motion of the heavenly bodies penetrates to every individual place and to every moment in which the heavenly body occupies that place, and just by this continual abstraction shows itself to be a law. If we thus look on abstractions as objective activity, which to this extent it is yet very different from subjective activity and its products. The former allows the heavenly body to fall again after abstraction from this place and this moment of time into the single changing place and moment, just as little allows the genus to appear in the species as well as in other contingent or inessential forms and the external singularity of individuals. Sorry, I misread that. Just as it allows the genus to appear in the species as well as in other contingent or inessential forms and in the external singularity of individuals. By contrast, subjective abstraction raises the law as well as the genus into its universality as such, and makes it exist and preserves it in this form in the mind. So that distinction between the objective and the subjective makes it so. Actually, let me just reread it more slowly. So rereading it again. We may certainly also express ourselves by saying that the term genus leaves aside in one of its species properties that it places in another, or that force leaves aside in one of its expression circumstances that are present in another, that these circumstances are thus shown by it to be inessential, and that it of itself gives up its expression and withdraws into inactivity and inwardness. We may also say,
okay,
for
wait
example,
a moment.
Okay.
So let's just think through this, right? So we have at least the word genus, right? Genus. Let's think genus as a abstract concept or a class, right? You have a certain properties, right? You have a certain individual. You are trying to make generalizations, right? These individuals is a determined individual. You start to find things which are common between many individuals. You take these properties and you create a certain genus, which is nothing but a certain concept, which has as a rule of inclusion those determinations that you deemed were common to those kind of individuals, right? So we are here. So we mercifully also express ourselves by saying that the term genus leaves aside in one of its species properties that it places in another. Okay. And that force leaves aside in one of its expressions circumstances that are present in another. That the circumstances are thus shown by it to be inessential, and that it is of itself gives its expression and withdraws into inactivity and weirdness. Well, I can't talk about force here because I'm not very much familiar with the logic of force. I understand what he's saying about genius here.
Well, with
The
force,
general basic theme.
yeah. If you let me say something about force.
Please.
The thing about force, the example would be like how the force of gravity, which they thought was a force back then, would be that okay, gravity is expressed in the relationship of the planets and the sun, and if you go to that specific relationship, you have Kepler's laws of motion. Then there is the expression of the relationships of the Earth, you say, and the Moon, and that another is a specific set of laws of motion. They have their own specific orbits or whatever. And then you have the law of gravity as such, which you abstract from all of these relationships as their genus. And that would be the G equals, I forget, like mass something writ to the radius over like radius squared.
Okay. Can we continue from the inactivity and inwardness?
Yeah. We may also say, for example, that the law of the motion of the heavenly bodies penetrates to every individual place and to every moment in which the heavenly body occupies that place, and just by this continual abstraction shows itself to be a law. If we thus look on abstraction as objective activity, which to this extent it is yet very different from subjective activity and its products. The former allows the heavenly body to fall again, after abstraction from this place in this moment of time, into the single changing place and moment. Okay, so first we have the generalized abstraction. Then we may also say, for example, that the law of the motion of heavenly bodies penetrates to every individual place into every moment in which the heavenly body occupies that place, and just by this continual abstraction shows itself to be a law. So we have the abstraction, the genus. Then we say the genus is actually present and penetrates into every individual instance in the species, the elements, every individual place, every moment in which the heavenly body occupies that place. And just by this continual abstraction shows itself to be a law. It's not quite clear to me what the continual abstraction is here. If we thus look on abstraction as objective activity, which to this extent it is yet very different from subjective activity and its products. The former, being abstraction as objective activity, allows the heavenly body to fall again, after abstraction from this place in this moment of time, into the single changing place and moment, just as it allows the genus to appear in the species as well as in other continued or essential forms and in the external singularity of individuals. Okay, so he starts with talking about subjective abstraction, which is just the genus from the individuals. Then he says we can reverse this to objective abstraction, which would be abstracting from that abstraction. So, if you have the law of gravity, the abstraction from the abstraction is to move towards defining concretion. So then the genus does not remain as genus, but is present in all the individual instances.
Yeah. I think what he's talking is actually very simple. Like, well, in the first moment when you are going to define a certain concept you are going to use, you will, if you have like, okay, we are departing here from a certain object given in the representation, right? So we have in front of us a fully determined object. So the first thing we're going to do, if we are to have any kind of concept, at least concept in the sense of class, we will need to abstract from most of those determinations that I present in representation, right? Because the object that I have in front of me standing against me in representation is fully determined. It has an hour, it has a very particular place, etc., etc., etc. So the first activity, subjective activity here, is when you abstract most of these determination, keeping only what you think is essential, right? Okay, so now you have the genes. You have, okay, so a nice person is a person who gives me gift, let's say. So and then when you look through the world, through this concept that a nice person is a person who gives me gifts, this initially subjective abstraction appears as a objective expression. Is that it? Like
So
you are simply a certain idea of self-fulfilling prophecy, So if you define things as such subjectively, objectively, they will appear as such for you. Just like those, like when you are in the middle of doctors. I am in Coimbra, right? So there are a lot of doctors here. Most of them are kind of awful, and it's funny because if the guy studies take evolutionary psychology, every explanation he has in his pocket will be derived from the basic determinations of the genus of evolutionary psychology. If I'm talking to a psychoanalyst, he will try to explain and to refer everything to the basic determinations of this discipline, etc., etc., etc. So this subjective activity in the initial definition of the genus, in which the subject abstracts from determinations which were present in the representation, becomes afterwards like something which appears as objective to this subjectivity. I don't know if I got here. I know that what I'm talking is right, but I don't know if it's right as a description to this passage. What do you think, guys?
I think what all he's really saying is you have a plurality of examples of some phenomena from which we abstract an unchanging concept. However, in finding that that concept is preserved in all of these examples, the concept is therefore also expressed in and as those examples. So you could say you move from, say, I don't know how to use the terms objectivity and subjectivity here. You could say you start with the objectivity of determinate examples, which you abstract to a subjective concept. But because that subjective concept is in itself a determinacy of the examples, it is in itself objective, and therefore the examples are subjectively, insofar as they're individuals, exemplars of that objective moment.
Yeah.
So determination
You are starting to see everything.
where you're looking at it from, and you can say, my concept is intuited, and what is intuited is my concept.
Yeah, but this is circular, right? So
it's circular.
You define things arbitrarily. You arbitrarily abstract certain determinations from certain completely determined thing, and then you create a genus, and then you look around looking for that genus, and of course you're going to find it, somewhere, because you are looking through the lens of that concept.
Yeah, but if it's just the comparison of concept and object, it's its own determinacy that is self-determining, so to speak. So it's not arbitrary in that sense.
Yeah, we haven't gotten there yet, but what Pedro's talking about does fall into what this is talking about. So I think you're both right. It's just different perspectives in which this applies both to an arbitrary notion of objective and subjective abstraction. But the objective abstraction at least will also be true, and the subjective abstraction will also be true to concepts as such in the proper Hegelian sense. So with
just one more interesting commentary on this. The problem of taxonomy is a very interesting problem to understand what Hegel is talking about here, right? How does taxonomy works? Basically, you establish certain criteria for the inclusion of individual in certain families, classes, genus, etc., 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 right? So, but the problem is, taxonomy is an empirical research. So the properties which are considered to be relevant to the inclusion of a certain individual in a certain class or family, etc., are all changing. They are changeable. They're contingent. There are people who have certain taxonomies based on the certain utilities of those individuals, which are very different of a taxonomy based on, say, genetic similarity, etc., etc., etc. So taxonomies are always revisable, right? Simply because there is this subjective initial activity in which certain properties are considered arbitrarily relevant to the determination of the pertainment of a certain individual to that class or genus or family, etc., etc., etc. Right?
Yeah, it's through
But
the.
it's
Oh, sorry.
no, I
Um,
finished.
right. It's through the self-determining concept, or the actually objective subject or subjective object, so to speak, that we recognize the contingency of these other determinations. Uh,
Yeah, I would say so. Let's see, we see is the former, the objective abstraction, allows the heavenly body to fall again. After abstraction from this place in this moment of time into the single changing place and moment, just as it allows the genus to appear in the species as well as in other contingent or inessential forms, and in the external singularity of individuals. So that's the movement of universal to particular or individual. By contrast,
First, there is the movement from particular to universal, right?
yeah,
Like in the subjective activity. And then there is this movement in which you take the genus, which were the result of your initial subjective activity, and apply to the world.
yeah. But in this case, it would be an application in which it does present itself. So, the law of gravity isn't arbitrarily applied upon the bodies. It is present in the bodies upon which it is applied.
Yeah.
So is this kind of formulation of what representation is in terms of conventional logic? What we were talking last time about how physics, for example, bases itself upon appearances from which it abstracts some attributes that it finds in the phenomena in a repeated sense, so it can construct a representation of that phenomena, and they then apply it to the concrete forms of that phenomena, adding ad hoc the new attributes that it can find in its own representation. Is it something like that?
It's related to that. This is a more primitive expression of just I think what he's doing here is just showing that even in these flawed abstractions, nonetheless there is a necessary part of cognition going on, where like the concept is imminent to this, even though we do it flawed. We're not very good at it naturally. We're doing it. So scientists are operating with the concept in the background of their abstractions. They're not doing it well, but they're doing it. So they go from they make these subjective abstractions, but they also make objective abstractions. What they're not good at is unifying these and linking them properly together and deriving. So the objective abstractions is what brings the universal to the particulars, and by contrast, subjective abstraction raises the law as well as the genus into its universality as such, and makes it exist and preserves it in this form in the mind. In these forms of knowledge that progress from mere indication to proof, from immediate objectivity to distinctive results, the necessity may be felt of explicitly considering the method, mode, and manner of subjective activity in order to test its claims and procedures. For this method has its own characteristics and way of proceeding that are quite different from the characteristics and processes of the object in itself. And without entering more specifically into this mode of knowledge, it becomes immediately apparent from a simple characteristic that we observe in it, that inasmuch as it is represented as being concerned with the object in accordance with subjective forms, it is only capable of apprehending relations of the object. It is therefore idle to raise the question whether these relations are objective and real or only subjective and ideal, not to mention the fact that such expressions as subjectivity and objectivity, reality and ideality, are simply vague abstractions. The content, be it objective or merely subjective, remains always the same, an aggregate of relations, not that which subsists in and for itself. The concept of the thing or the infinite with which knowledge must have to do, if that content of knowledge is taken by distorted sense as containing relations only, and if these are understood to be phenomena or relations for subjective knowledge, then such results must forever be recognized as the great intellectual achievement of modern philosophy. That the mode of thinking, proving, and knowing just described is incapable of reaching the infinite, the eternal, and the divine.
Yeah, it may be proper to study finite objects, but it is not. It is a finite mode of treating infinite objects, right? He's basically doing like a long, very interesting description of the understanding, right? It's logically having this text over here. Very interesting.
Yeah, this is a better introduction to the problems and understanding than the other essays. Well, the other introductions I've read. The logic does not go into.
I still think that the best introduction to the system is the two introductions of the science of logic. Because, for example, a naive person wouldn't understand what is the problem of a difference between content and form here, right? Like, it's something that you only get explicitly talked about, like in a rudimentary manner in the first introduction, in the general concept of logic, in the science of logic, you know? So, but what is the problem between the difference between form and content? Well, because the form always is external and arbitrary in reference to the content, and it always supposes itself to be proper when it is not. It has not derived this authority over anything else, right? Anyway, I don't think, just to say that I don't think this is a good introduction to Hegel at fucking all. I'm still like I get this shit because I've read the logic, you know. That's my position here. And also, I don't think that phenomenology of spirit is a good introduction either. Read obsessively the two introductions to the science of logic, and then try to read the text itself. But this is not a good introduction at all.
Yeah, no, I mean,
this
definitely. I don't think it's that tough. Like, I don't think he's like talking in like too much Hegelese. As a matter of fact, he's taking a lot of space, kind of rewording the ways in which he normally says things. Like, I mean, he's described the concept so many times. He's described the speculative method already in certain ways. But these were meant for people who already are, in some manner, reading the logic and familiar with it to a little bit of extent.
What year is this text from, or this lecture?
1829.
Oh, right. I think most of these sentences are not that speculative. Like, they're quite explicit.
They're quite intelligible.
Their meaning and their unity. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah. I'd certainly say this is probably not an easy beginner text for somebody who's just getting into philosophy and they're like, oh, I'm going to read Hegel. Well, if you do that, you're already crazy, but welcome to the club. That's what I did.
I think this seems to be like a good introduction if you've already studied the Critique of Pure Reason, maybe. Yeah, that's quite a path.
It makes allusions to it. I disagree with people who say like you need to read Kant before Hegel.
Yeah.
Just because the references aren't actually that heavy, and where Hegel deals with Kant, it's mostly to disabuse you of thinking that he is Kant.
Yeah. my stance with that is that probably you've already worked through like Kant's mode of cognition if you have engaged in any form or way with conventional science nowadays in most of philosophy. So yeah, not necessary to read Kant to read Hegel.
I wouldn't say that. Like most of scientists are naively realists nowadays. Like they think they're dealing with objects which are uh, constituted before any cognition, and that they go there and they try to exact the content of their thought to the content of the object being presented, and then there is no such a thing as a contribution of the subjective side to the constitution of the object itself, you know. So I think Kant is important in that sense because most people are realists. They believe in a world which is self-standing, which does not depend on being thought to be structured, right? In which there is no such a thing as a subjective uh, contribution. Like people are mostly completely unaware that they use certain fundamental concepts to structure their experience, such as existence, something, limit, etc., etc., etc. And I think the scientists, as they are very humble, very, very humble, they don't give a fuck about that. They are like straightforward realists, most of them. Of course, there are some sophisticated scientific thinkers, but they don't. That's not their job. I think their job is shut up and calculate.
Yeah, but their simple-minded realism produces a kind of superficial Kantism in the sense that, as does Kant, they think that conceptual thinking is only a species of the genius representation. So they think they have to construct the object, and that construction cannot refer to the necessity, the immanent necessity of the object they're researching. There's always a gap. That's what I mean when I say that you kind of you have to, yeah.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. That a consistent realism leads to the Kantian position, anyways. That there are things in themselves, and that there is a possibility that even with a perfectly coherent knowledge, you may have it may be completely at odds with what the world really is in itself. But anyways, let's continue. What has been brought out in the preceding exposition about knowledge in general and discursive knowledge, more precisely, which alone is what concerns us, and about the principal element in such knowledge, namely proof, we have looked at in terms of its being a movement of discursive activity that is outside the object and different from the object's own becoming. This specification is to be taken partly as sufficient for our purposes, but partly also as what is essential in regard to the one-sidedness that lies in reflections about the subjectivity of knowledge. In the opposition between knowing and the object to be known lies the finitude of knowledge, but this opposition is not on that account to be regarded as itself infinite and absolute, and its results are not to be taken as phenomena because of the mere abstraction of subjectivity. Rather, insofar as the results themselves are determined by that opposition, the content as such is affected by the indicated externality. The latter point of view has an effect on the condition of the content and yields a specific insight into it, whereas the former mode of consideration yields nothing but the abstract category of the subjective, which is, moreover, taken to be absolute. As far as the otherwise quite general quality of the content is concerned, what we arrive at from the way in which we look at the proof is, speaking generally, just this: that the content, inasmuch as it bears an external relation to knowledge, is itself determined as something external, or more precisely, consists of abstractions from finite properties. Mathematical content, as such, is essentially quantity or magnitude. Geometrical figures pertain to space, and have thus in themselves externality as their principle, since they are distinguished from real objects and represent the one-sided spatiality of these objects, but by no means the concrete realization by which they first become actual. Likewise, number has the unit as its principle, and is the putting together of a multiplicity of independent units. Thus it is a completely external combination. The knowledge that we have before us Here it can attain its greatest perfection only in this field because the latter has simple and stable qualities, and the interdependence of these qualities, insight into which is proof, is likewise stable, thus ensuring for proof the consistent progression of necessity. This kind of knowledge is able to exhaust the nature of its objects. The consistency of proof is not, however, confined to mathematical content, but enters into all departments of natural and spiritual material. We can summarize what is logically consistent in demonstrative knowledge by saying that it depends on the rules of inference. The proofs of the existence of God are therefore essentially inferences. The express investigation of these forms, however, belongs in part to logic, but also in part the fundamental defect in the forms must be ascertained in the upcoming discussions of these proofs. Here it suffices to remark further in connection with what has been said that the rules of inference have a type of foundation that is of the nature of mathematical calculation. The connection of propositions that are needed to form a syllogistic conclusion depends on the relationship of the range that each occupies vis-a-vis the other, and that is properly regarded as greater or smaller. The specific extent of such a sphere is what determines the correctness of the subsumption. The older logicians, such as Lampert and Plouquet, have been at pains to invent a notation by which the relation in inference is reduced to identities, that is, to the abstract mathematical relation of equality, so that inference is shown to be the mechanism of calculation. As to the sort of knowledge that is involved in such an external connection of objects, which in the very nature are intrinsically external, we shall have to speak of it presently under the term mediated knowledge, and to consider the more precise opposition. Speaking of formalisms, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I do think this is a really good companion to what he talks about when he talks about the externality of quantitative of mathematics and how philosophy has addressed its subject, its the concrete forms that it tries to explain through that externality and a method based upon that externality. I think he develops much more extensively what he means by that in the logic. I don't know what do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, and the logic is the one place where you would expect him to really extend on that. His sections on mathematics are, at least within Hegelian scholarship, legendary. His hatred.
Yeah, but I mean, Pedro was saying that the introduction is a better place to start with if you want to address the abstraction of a form from its content, and therefore the abstraction of a content from its form. But I think that here he addresses that abstraction more extensively in terms of the externality of mathematical thinking when it pertains to philosophical thinking.
Yeah, in that specific form, I would say.
I wouldn't say otherwise, but what I think is much clearer in the introduction. Like he himself said in the beginning of the text that these lectures would be better understood while as supplements to his lectures on logic, right?
Yeah.
When you understand that if you do not allow for the possibility of the identity between form and content in thinking, everything which is thought will be forever external to thinking itself, right? That is the kind of standpoint which leads us to a certain conception of truth which is impossible. The idea that truth is impossible, right? So there will always be something external to thought itself, conditioning thought without being able to be presented to thought as something which springs out of thought itself. So that will lead us to nihilism. I think that definitely lead anyone to nihilism. This problem. So the only solution to that would be to take thinking itself as its object, and to take every form of thinking, such as such as inference, the idea of inference, the idea of something, anyway, cause and effect, etc., and to take them as being needed to spring out of the self activity or self thinking thought, right? What I think he's referring here, which is very obvious for anyone who has actually passed some time in the infernal company of Hegel, is that many people will have a certain difficulty in thinking such a concept as force as a concept which possibly can spring out of pure reason, self-thinking thought, you know.
Mhm.
So they will only consider the concept of force as something, as an abstraction from what they think is objective reality, right? Just like life, right? For many people, it is very strange to get into a book of logic and see the concept of life being treated there, right? For most people, life is an empirical concept, is a generalization from certain individuals which we encounter in the world. It is not a pure category of thinking, you know. It is something that is the result of a certain subjective activity of abstraction from individuals, right? So what I think he's trying to say to his students here is that, well, guys, you are going to see that such things as force, laws, genera, etc., is not only related to thinking or to knowledge externally, but actually they spring out from within thought itself. They are categories of thinking. They are not pure and simply, as you would think they are, generalizations from empirical sense data.
Right.
Yeah, Sagwate,
more,
I don't know what time you came in. Actually, in the prior lecture, he went in for about 2 pages on specifically that issue of mathematics and geometry is externality.
Yeah.
Nice. Gonna read it. No, I just came when we were starting this one. You told me we were on page 76. What I was gonna say that it is not mere. They are not mere categories of thought, I think, but of the unity of thought and being. That's like something important.
That's another issue. Like if what is intelligible, the categories of thought are the categories of being. That's another issue. Like
but
Yeah,
it's a
let's keep going.
clarification that pertains to the problem of life, because relative to that concept, it is a really good example of the problems you get with what is now called empirical abstractions or formal abstractions, what we're looking at here as subjective abstractions, because the concept of life in biology is an impossible concept. You cannot define life. It can't be defined by means of the empirical separation of attributes, because you have you cannot find the necessity of that concept. It is too complex of a necessity. It is constituted by too complex of a necessity for it to be assessed by means of empirical abstraction, and you have biases and everything.
Yeah, but one thing that Antonio said, that even though they are not aware, they are operating. Scientists are operating with a concept, because if you look at it, if you go, like, I've been studying, I study a bit of biology because everything which is human concerns me, and they have a pretty spot on definition of life, even though they didn't read the science of logic. And most biologists nowadays, they actually are slowly abandoning the idea that they can explain life referring to dynamics of more abstract entities such as molecules, atoms, and stuff like that. You know, they are slowly understanding that what actually is going on is that these more abstract entities, such as atoms and molecules, they are actually being determined by life, not the other way around. You know, so it's interesting to see. Now I understand better your commentary, Antonio, on they are actually operating with the concept, but they don't know, right? Because most of the time they are not that far off from the speculative concept of life in biology. Even though they had their reductive dream, they're starting to understand that maybe it's not the atom which explains life, but life that explains retrospectively the atom, right?
Yep, it's been a while since I've actually been reading on such things. But I'm not surprised. Last I knew, the last time I looked was like, yeah, probably about 12 years ago, in which I was really into looking at stuff. And back then I recognized that at least on the forefront of things, they had achieved the Kantian standpoint at last in most of the sciences. Still wasn't the general view, but the people at the forefront at least had made it to that spot. And in other sciences, particularly, like for example, what's that guy we talked to? Well, I won't mention his name. It's kind of irrelevant. But there's somebody we talked to, and he gave us some books in which about neurology, particularly neuropsychological development, and how the people at the forefront of that are basically have arrived at the concept. They just don't know it. It's still haphazard, but the model they've arrived at is basically the concept.
Yeah.
Anyways, let's continue. As regards those forms that are called general laws, forces, etc., knowledge is not related to them externally. They are rather its products. But the knowledge that produces them, as has been shown, does so only by abstraction from what is objective. They have their root in objectivity, but are essentially separated from actuality. They are more concrete than mathematical figures, but their content differs essentially from their starting point, which constitutes their demonstrative foundation. Okay, well. Didn't expect to see this one here. The first chapter was about faith and thought, mostly. So thought we were kind of done with that distinction, but all right, let's turn to faith. The defective element in this mode of knowledge thus becomes noticeable in an aspect that differs from the view that declares the products of knowledge to be phenomena, because knowledge itself is only a subjective activity. But the general result is similar, and we have now to see what has been said over against this result. Because spirit inwardizes the infinite, eternal, and divine, what is insufficient for its purposes is the activity of spirit that proceeds discursively by means of abstraction, inference, and proof. This view, itself the product of the shape of thought in our time, has jumped straight over to the other extreme and proposing an indemonstrable and immediate knowing, a non-cognitive faith, a feeling devoid of thought, as the only way of grasping and having within oneself divine truth. It is asserted that the kind of knowledge that is insufficient for the higher truth is the sole and exclusive kind of knowledge. Just a thing I realized right now, there's a commentary on the general text so far. This has the form of a dialectic. Of a proper dialectic. I mean, we began with just the immediacies of how does the problem of the issue of faith and knowledge even arise? Through the question of God. Then we have what is the crude distinction between faith, reason, or thought. We had a bit of historical explanation of how these two were originally unified. The distinction of faith and thought is a very modern thing, whereas in the past there was no issue in unifying these. They were kind of consonant with each other.
Yeah. Like the problem of faith only arises when there is a subjectivity asking for reasons, right?
Particularly a specific kind of general unity of reason.
Yeah.
So anyway, so he had that explained. So we had the explained primary distinction, the originary object which causes their distinction, the object of God. Then their first abstraction, their first negation, in which they're distinct but unified. So they weren't fully negated. The full negation happens in the Enlightenment, in which like the problem of God just kind of tips over into the critique of religion in general, which then causes religion to step aside to its own extreme and causes reason to step aside to its own extreme in the Enlightenment. And then so far in this lecture, the second lecture, we've investigated the particular way in which reason on its own extreme developed itself as the form of proofs, the various kinds of proofs, empirical proofs, mathematical proofs, and then Hegel finishes it up by always having the implication of the proof he's talking about, which is the self-generative proof. And so now I suppose we're turning to how faith determined itself in its own extreme. So anyways, I bring that up just so that in case those people who are listening did not come up to your notice, you can now notice there is a development internally happening here, and he's just doing it. You know, he doesn't have to say I'm doing it. He's just doing it, which is part of what causes people to miss a lot in Hegel, in which like they expect Hegel to hold their hands on every step and say, look, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, and now look, we're going to do this, and Hegel's not that way. Hegel does it, and it's up to you to catch on. So continuing, the two assumptions are most closely connected, meaning it is asserted the kind of knowledge that is insufficient for the higher truth is the sole and exclusive kind of knowledge. The two assumptions are most closely connected. On the one side, we must, in the investigation of what we have undertaken to consider, free such knowledge from its one-sidedness, and at the same time provide evidence that there is another kind of knowledge than that which is given out as the only kind. On the other side, the pretension that faith has such advances against knowledge is a prejudice that occupies too firm and sure a position not to make a stricter investigation necessary. In view of this pretension, it is to be kept in mind that true and unbiased faith is all the less pretentious in situations where it might reasonably be so, and that the necessity of being pretentious exists only for the merely rationalizing, dry, and polemical assertion of faith. Okay, this seems like an interesting footnote. Footnote 6. That rational knowledge in the Kantian sense is incapable of attaining to the knowledge of God, and that it is the only form of knowledge, Hegel found to be asserted by Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, B edition, second edition, section 595 to 732, as well as by Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, on the letters of Spinoza, on the letters, not letters, but it is about the letters on Spinoza by Moses Mendelssohn, which caused the whole Spinoza controversy. Excerpts translated in the in place of this.
That is a good introduction to Hegel. Those letters. At least to the problematic that would be central to the German idealist, the problem of the opposition between morality and materialism, or substantial monism, or free and a certain scientific cosmovision of the world in which everything is caused, everything is explainable by something which is prior to it, etc.
Mm-hmm. No, sorry. Let me continue this. In place of this insufficient knowledge, Jacobi in particular posited immediate knowing or feeling as the organon of the God relationship. In his later writings, Jacobi described this immediate God consciousness as reason, which he contrasted with understanding, and he tried to connect the Kantian view with his own. Okay. I did not know that. That's something new. Continuing. But I have already explained elsewhere how matters stand in regard to faith, or immediate knowledge. At the beginning of any attempt to deal at the present time with the proofs of the existence of God, it cannot be assumed that the position asserted by faith can be set aside as done with. The chief points from which it is to be criticized, and the place to be assigned to it, must at least be called to mind.
Okay, and we are done with the second lecture. Are we going to the third lecture?
No, we'll leave it here. We've been going
Kind
for...
of tired.
Yeah, we've been going for 2 hours and 20 minutes. That's a good enough.
My God, this is dance shit.
All right, well, for those of you listening, hopefully you enjoyed these. We'll see if we do some more sometime this week. But anyways, see you next time.